They were laughed at for buying a collapsing barn with their last $300. But when the elderly couple climbed into the hayloft one final time before demolition, what they found inside a rusted safe would prove every doubter devastatingly wrong. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning sun barely pierced through the haze settling over Porter's Ridge, a town so small you could drive through it in 3 minutes if you didn't blink. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and if they didn't know, they'd make it up over coffee at Mabel's diner. Dalton Reed sat on the crooked steps of his single-wide trailer, a mug of watered-down coffee cooling in his calloused hands. He was 72 years old, but his hands told the story of 90. Every scar, every swollen knuckle, every permanently grease-stained fingernail spoke of a lifetime spent working, fixing, surviving. Beside him, his wife Arletta hummed softly, her thin frame wrapped in a cardigan 2 sizes too big. She was 70, though most days she felt older. Cancer had tried to take her 6 years ago, and though she'd won that battle, the war had cost them everything. The medical bills came like a flood, drowning their savings, their retirement, their modest home. They'd sold it all piece by piece just to keep her alive. And now they lived here, on the forgotten edge of town, in a trailer with a leaking roof and a furnace that only worked when it felt generous. People in Porter's Ridge didn't look at them anymore, not really. They looked past them, the way you look past faded billboards or abandoned gas stations. Dalton and Arletta had become part of the landscape, unremarkable, invisible, broke. But Dalton still dreamed. He stared out at the dirt road that stretched toward the center of town, and his mind wandered to the farm he'd grown up on. His grandfather's land, 60 acres of corn and soybeans, red barns that stood tall against the sky, silos that smelled like grain and summer. He remembered the weight of tools in his hands, the satisfaction of fixing a tractor engine, the pride in building something that would last. It had been decades since he'd felt that, decades since he'd built anything but survival. Arletta reached over and squeezed his hand. Her fingers were thin, bird-like, but her grip was firm. She didn't need to say anything. After 51 years of marriage, words were optional. "You thinking about it again?" she asked softly. Dalton smiled. "Always." "You know we can't afford dreams, Dal." "I know," he said, "but they're free to think about." She chuckled, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "Free don't pay bills." Inside the trailer, the television buzzed with the morning news. The anchor's voice drifted through the screen door, talking about stock markets and political scandals, things that felt like they belonged to a different planet. Dalton finished his coffee and stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. Today was Saturday, which meant one thing in Porter's Ridge: the county auction. Every first Saturday of the month, the county auctioned off seized properties, abandoned lots, and anything else nobody wanted. Most folks went for entertainment, to gossip, maybe pick up a rusted lawnmower or a box of old tools. Dalton had been going for years, not to buy, but to dream. He liked to imagine what he'd do with a piece of land, how he'd restore a barn, plant a garden, build something beautiful one last time. Arletta watched him pull on his worn denim jacket. "You're going to the auction?" "Thought I might." She tilted her head. "Dal, we don't have money to spend on—" "I'm not spending," he said gently, "just looking." But as he said it, his hand brushed against the envelope tucked into his jacket pocket. Inside was $300, every penny they had left in the world. They'd been saving it for winter, for propane, for emergencies. He didn't know why he'd brought it. Maybe because hope, no matter how foolish, still lived somewhere deep in his chest. By 10 in the morning, the auction yard was packed. Trucks lined the gravel lot, tailgates down, men leaning against them with arms crossed and ball caps pulled low. Women gathered in clusters, chatting, laughing, sipping gas station coffee. Dalton walked slowly through the crowd, nodding to a few familiar faces. Most didn't nod back. He spotted Benny Cartwright, a local contractor in his 40s, loud and broad-shouldered, holding court near the auction stage. Benny had bought up half the foreclosed properties in the county over the last decade. He wasn't there for nostalgia. He was there for profit. "Hey, old man Reed," Benny called out with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You finally gonna buy something today? Or just window shopping again?" A few people laughed. Dalton kept walking. "Leave him alone, Benny," someone muttered. "What? I'm just saying man's been coming here for years and never bids on a damn thing. Just takes up space." Dalton ignored him. He'd learned a long time ago that some people fed on cruelty the way plants fed on sunlight. No point in watering them with a response. The auctioneer climbed onto the platform, a wiry man in his 60s with a voice that could cut through sheet metal. "All right, folks, let's get started. First up, Lot 17, 2-acre plot on Miller Road. Starts at 500. Dalton watched as hands shot up, voices overlapping, prices climbing. He didn't bother raising his hand. He just listened, absorbing the rhythm of it, the energy. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat. "Next item, Lot 23. Abandoned barn property, 4 acres, old Grayson Farm out on Route 9. Structures in rough shape, no utilities, no access road maintained. Starts at $100. The crowd went silent. A few people exchanged glances. Dalton's heart skipped. 100? Anyone? Nothing. Come on, folks. It's 4 acres. Land's worth something. Someone in the back yelled, "That barn's gonna collapse in the next storm. It's a liability." "So tear it down and sell the lumber," the auctioneer shot back. $50. Do I hear 50? Dalton felt his hand move before his brain caught up. He raised it slowly. The auctioneer pointed. 50 from the gentleman in the blue jacket. Do I hear 75? Silence. Benny Cartwright laughed. "You serious, Reed? You gonna waste your money on that death trap?" Dalton didn't look at him. He kept his hand raised. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. "Going once? Going twice?" 100, a woman's voice called from the side. Dalton turned. It was Marla Pike, a real estate agent who bought fixer-uppers and flipped them. She stood with her arms crossed, smirking. Dalton's jaw tightened. 150. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People started whispering. "Is he nuts? He doesn't have that kind of money." "Poor guy's lost it." Marla raised an eyebrow. 200. Dalton felt Arletta's hand on his shoulder. He hadn't heard her walk up. She leaned close and whispered, "Dal, what are you doing?" "I don't know," he admitted, but he raised his hand again. 250. The crowd erupted. People turned to stare, some shaking their heads, others outright laughing. Benny Cartwright slapped his knee. "Old man's finally cracked." Marla hesitated, then shrugged. "Not worth it." She dropped out. The auctioneer grinned. 250 going once, twice, sold to the gentleman in blue. Dalton stood frozen, his heart hammering. Arletta squeezed his shoulder. He'd just spent nearly everything they had on a collapsing barn and 4 acres of overgrown weeds. What the hell had he done? The paperwork took 20 minutes. Dalton signed his name with shaking hands, handed over $300 in rumpled bills. The clerk counted twice, slowly, as if expecting them to vanish, and received a deed in return. The paper felt impossibly light for something that had just cost him everything. Arletta stood beside him in silence. She didn't scold him. She didn't lecture. She just took his arm and walked with him back to the truck. A 1987 Ford pickup with more rust than paint. They climbed in, and Dalton sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the deed on the dashboard. "You think I'm crazy," he said quietly. Arletta looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled, soft and sad. "I think you're a man who needed to believe in something again." Tears burned behind his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He turned the key and the engine coughed to life. They drove out of town in silence, past the diner, past the post office, past the judgmental stares of people who had already decided they knew how this story would end. Route 9 stretched into farmland, fields that had once been gold with corn now choked with thistle and wild grass. The road narrowed, pavement giving way to gravel, and finally, there it was, the Grayson barn. Dalton pulled off onto the shoulder, and they both stared. The structure loomed against the pale sky like the skeleton of some great beast. The wood was weathered grey, splintered in places, with sections of siding missing entirely. The roof sagged in the middle, tin panels peeling away like old skin. Vines crawled up the sides, weaving through gaps and cracks. The foundation, red brick worn smooth by a century of rain, was the only part that still looked solid. Arletta exhaled slowly. "Oh, Dal." He climbed out of the truck. The air smelled like earth and decay, but underneath it, faint and familiar, was the scent of old hay and wood. He walked toward the barn, boots crunching through knee-high weeds. Arletta followed, one hand on his back. The main doors were chained shut, padlock rusted into place. Dalton walked around the side, found a gap in the boards and squeezed through. Inside, the space was vast and dim. Sunlight sliced through holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes that swirled like snow. The floor was dirt, packed hard over decades. Old tools hung on walls, hay bales rotted in corners, and above, a loft stretched across the back half of the barn, its ladder missing half its rungs. Arletta stepped inside beside him. "It's bigger than I thought." "It's perfect," Dalton whispered. She looked at him. "It's falling apart." "So are we," he said with a sad smile. "Doesn't mean we're not worth saving." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property. 4 acres might not sound like much, but when you're 70 and 72, it feels endless. The land rolled gently, dotted with old fence posts and wild blackberry bushes. A creek ran along the back edge, shallow but clear. Dalton knelt beside it, dipped his fingers in the cold water, and felt something stir in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. By the time they returned to the trailer that evening, word had already spread. Their neighbor, a woman named Patty, who lived 3 lots down, was standing on their steps holding a casserole dish. "Heard you bought the old Grayson place," she said carefully. Dalton nodded. "That's right." Patty bit her lip. "Dal, honey, people are saying, well, they're worried you and Arletta might have been, taken advantage of." "We weren't," Arletta said firmly. "We knew exactly what we were buying." Patty shifted. "It's just, that place is dangerous. The structure's unsound. You could get hurt out there." "We'll be careful," Dalton said. Patty handed over the casserole. "Well, if you need anything, you let me know. I mean it." She left, and Arletta set the dish on the counter. She turned to Dalton, arms crossed. "People think we've lost our minds." "Maybe we have," he said, "but it's ours to lose." The next morning they went back, and the morning after that, and the one after that. They brought garbage bags, work gloves, a rake Dalton had owned since 1979. They cleared weeds, hauled away broken glass, stacked rotted boards. The work was slow, painfully slow, but it was work. And for the first time in years, Dalton didn't feel invisible. On the 4th day, a truck pulled up. Dalton straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. A man in his 50s climbed out, clipboard in hand. He wore a county vest and steel-toed boots. "Mr. Reed?" "That's me. I'm Jeff Hoskins, county building inspector. Got a call that someone's working on this property." Dalton's stomach tightened. "It's my property. Bought it legal." "I'm not here to challenge that," Jeff said. "But I gotta do my job. Mind if I take a look inside?" Dalton gestured toward the barn. Jeff walked slowly around it, peering at the foundation, testing boards, taking notes. Dalton and Arletta stood back, holding hands, waiting. Finally, Jeff returned. His face was serious. "Mr. Reed, I'm going to be straight with you. This structure is not safe. The load-bearing beams are compromised, the roof's about to go, and that loft, if anyone steps up there, it could give way." Dalton nodded slowly. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to either invest serious money into stabilizing it or tear it down before someone gets killed." Arletta's grip tightened. Dalton swallowed hard. "How much money we talking?" Jeff shook his head. "More than it's worth. Honestly, my recommendation is demolition." He handed Dalton a yellow notice, climbed back into his truck, and drove away. Arletta read the paper over Dalton's shoulder. It was an official warning. If the structure wasn't addressed within 60 days, the county could force demolition and bill them for it. Dalton folded the notice carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He looked at the barn, at the sagging roof and broken boards, and felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. "What do we do?" Arletta asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He just walked toward the barn, stepped inside, and stood in the center of the space. The light fell around him in golden shafts. He closed his eyes and remembered his grandfather's farm. He remembered the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the sound of hammers ringing, the pride in a day's work well done. When he opened his eyes, Arletta was beside him. "We're not giving up," he said. "Dal, we can't afford—" "I know," he said, "but we're not giving up. Not yet." Over the next 2 weeks, they worked every single day. People drove by slowly, watching, whispering. Some honked and waved. Others just stared like they were witnessing a slow-motion tragedy. Dalton ignored them all. He patched holes, cleared debris, stabilized what he could with zip ties and prayer. On a Saturday afternoon, a beat-up Honda Civic pulled onto the property. Dalton looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a teenage girl with dark hair pulled into a messy bun and paint-stained jeans. Juniper. Their granddaughter, 16 years old, smart as a whip and stubborn as her grandfather. She lived 2 towns over with her mom, Dalton, and Arletta's daughter, but visited when she could. She walked toward them, hands in her pockets, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Heard you guys bought a barn," she said. Arletta grinned. "Word travels fast." "Mom says you're crazy," Dalton chuckled. "She's probably right." Juniper dropped her backpack and looked around. "So what's the plan?" "Right now," Dalton said, "just trying to make it safe enough to walk through." Juniper nodded. "Cool, I'll help." "You don't have to—" "I know," she interrupted, "but I want to." And just like that, the work became lighter. Juniper was young and strong, and more importantly, she believed in them. She hauled trash, swept floors, climbed ladders. Dalton couldn't anymore. She asked questions, listened to his stories, laughed at Arletta's jokes. For the first time in weeks, the barn didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a project, a family project. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange and purple, the 3 of them sat on the tailgate of Dalton's truck, sharing sandwiches and bottled water. Juniper's phone buzzed and she glanced at it, frowning. "What's wrong?" Arletta asked. "Just some kids from school," Juniper said. "They're making fun of you guys." Dalton sighed. "Let them. They're saying you wasted your money, that you're like too old to do this." "They're not wrong," Dalton said. "We are old." "But you're not giving up," Juniper said fiercely. "That's what matters." Arletta smiled. "You sound like your grandpa." "Good," Juniper said, "because I think what you're doing is awesome." Dalton's throat tightened. He looked at his granddaughter, then at the barn, then at his wife. Maybe they were crazy. Maybe they'd wasted their last $300. But for the first time in years, he felt alive. 2 weeks later, Jeff Hoskins returned. He walked the property again, checked the repairs Dalton had made, and took more notes. When he finished, he approached them, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Reed," he said, "I gotta be honest. What you've done here, it's impressive, but it's not enough. The core structure is still compromised." Dalton's heart sank. "However," Jeff continued, "I can give you an extension, another 60 days. If you can get a licensed contractor out here to do a full assessment and stabilization, I'll sign off on it. But if not, we're back to demolition." Dalton nodded. "Thank you." Jeff tipped his hat and left. Arletta turned to Dalton. "We don't have money for a contractor." "I know. Then what are we going to do?" Dalton looked at the barn. He thought about the inspector's words, the core structure, the foundation, and suddenly an idea flickered in his mind. "We're going to do one final walkthrough," he said. "Every inch of this place. If we're going to lose it, I want to know I saw everything." Arletta nodded. "Okay." Juniper agreed to come back the following weekend. On Saturday morning, the three of them arrived at the barn with flashlights, crowbars, and a sense of finality. They started on the ground floor, checking every corner, every beam, every hidden space. Juniper found old bottles tucked into the walls. Arletta discovered a rusted toolbox filled with antique wrenches. And then Dalton looked up. The loft. He'd avoided it for weeks, knowing it was unstable, but now, standing beneath it, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The floorboards weren't uniform. One section, near the back, looked different, newer, or maybe just arranged strangely. "I'm going up," he said. "Dal, no," Arletta said. "Jeff said it's not safe." "I'll be careful." "Grandpa, seriously," Juniper said. "Let me go, I'm lighter." But Dalton was already moving toward the ladder. He tested the first rung. It held. He climbed slowly, each step creaking under his weight. Arletta and Juniper stood below, watching, breath held. When he reached the top, Dalton pulled himself onto the loft floor. The wood groaned but didn't give. He crawled forward carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air up here was thick with dust and the smell of old hay. And then he saw it. A section of the floor, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, covered with loose boards that didn't match the rest. He brushed away the hay and dirt, revealing a pattern, deliberate, hidden. His heart began to pound. "Arletta," he called down, "there's something up here." "What?" "I don't know yet." He pulled at the boards. They came away easily, too easily, as if someone had designed them to be removed. Beneath them was a void, and in that void, something large and dark. Dalton leaned closer, shining his light into the gap. His breath stopped. It was a safe. Massive, iron, rusted at the edges but intact, built directly into the floor joists, hidden beneath decades of hay and time. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Arletta shouted. "What is it?" Dalton sat back on his heels, staring at the safe. His mind raced. Who had put this here? When? And more importantly, what was inside? He looked down at his wife and granddaughter, both staring up at him with wide eyes. "You're not going to believe this," he said, voice shaking, "but I think we just found something." Dalton's hands trembled as he knelt on the loft floor, staring down at the iron safe embedded in the floor joists. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight, and for a moment he wondered if he was hallucinating. If exhaustion and hope had finally twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't there. But no, the metal was real, cold and solid under his fingertips. Rust had claimed the edges, turning them the color of dried blood, but the center remained intact, a massive wheel lock sitting in the middle like the eye of some ancient creature. "Grandpa!" Juniper's voice echoed from below, tight with worry. "Are you okay?" Dalton crawled backward slowly, his knees screaming in protest. He reached the ladder and descended carefully, one rung at a time, until his boots hit solid ground. Arletta grabbed his arm the moment he was down, her face pale. "What did you find?" she whispered. "A safe," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "A big one, built right into the floor." Arletta blinked. "A safe?" Juniper stepped closer, eyes wide. "Like a bank vault safe." "Bigger," Dalton said. Has to be 4 feet across, maybe more. Iron, old as the barn itself. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them like snow. Outside, wind rattled the loose tin panels on the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. But inside the barn, time seemed to have stopped. Arletta finally spoke, her voice careful. "Who would put a safe up there?" "I don't know," Dalton admitted, "but someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it." Juniper pulled out her phone and started typing. "The Grayson farm, right? Let me see if I can find anything online." While she searched, Dalton walked to the truck and retrieved a thermos of coffee. His hands shook as he poured a cup, the liquid sloshing over the rim. Arletta took it from him gently and set it on the tailgate. "Sit down before you fall down," she said. He obeyed, sinking onto the tailgate beside her. His heart was still racing, thumping against his ribs like something trying to escape. He'd climbed that ladder a dozen times in his mind over the past weeks, always stopping himself, always listening to the inspector's warnings, and now he'd found this. Juniper looked up from her phone. "Okay, so the Grayson family owned this land from 1873 until 1938. The last owner was a guy named Elias Grayson. He was a farmer, but apparently he also bought up oil rights in the area during the 1920s. Dalton leaned forward. "Oil rights?" "Yeah," Juniper continued, scrolling. "There was a small oil boom around here back then, nothing like Texas, but enough that some farmers made serious money. Elias was one of them. But then he died suddenly in 1938. Heart attack. The property sat empty for years, went through a bunch of different owners, and eventually got abandoned." Arletta looked at Dalton. If he made money from oil, why would he hide it in a barn? "This was the Depression era," Dalton said slowly, his grandfather's stories flooding back. "People didn't trust banks. My granddad used to tell me about farmers who buried cash in their fields, hid gold in their walls. They'd seen banks collapse, seen people lose everything overnight." "So Elias might have stashed his fortune up there?" Juniper asked. "Maybe," Dalton said. "Or maybe it's empty. Could be nothing." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Something in his gut told him that safe hadn't been hidden for nothing. Arletta stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. "So what do we do?" Dalton met her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do we call someone? The county? Police?" Juniper frowned. "Why would we call the police?" "Because," Arletta said carefully, "if there's something valuable in there, it might not legally be ours." Dalton considered this. The thought had crossed his mind too. But then he remembered the deed sitting in their trailer, the $300 they'd paid, the weeks of back-breaking work. They'd bought this property fair and square, everything on it, everything under it. "It's ours," he said quietly. "We own the land, the barn, everything in it." "But No," he said, standing. "If we call someone, they'll take it. Doesn't matter what the law says. People with money and lawyers always win. You know that." Arletta's face tightened because she did know. They both did. They'd learned that lesson when the hospital bills came, when insurance denied coverage, when collections agencies circled like vultures. "So we open it ourselves?" Juniper asked. Dalton looked at his granddaughter, then at his wife. "Not we. Me. If this goes bad, I don't want you two involved." "That's stupid," Juniper said flatly. "We're already involved." Arletta nodded. "She's right. We're in this together." Dalton wanted to argue, but the truth was he needed them. He was 72 years old with bad knees and a heart that skipped beats when it felt like it. If he was going to do this, he couldn't do it alone. "Okay," he said, "but we keep this quiet. Nobody else knows. Not yet." They agreed. That night, Dalton couldn't sleep. He lay in the narrow bed of the trailer, Arletta breathing softly beside him, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. His mind spun with possibilities. What if the safe held money? What if it held nothing? What if opening it triggered some kind of legal nightmare? But beneath all those questions was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. The kind that made your blood hum and your hands itch to get to work. By dawn, he was already dressed and heading out the door. He spent Sunday alone at the barn, studying the safe. He cleared away more of the debris around it, revealing the full scope of the installation. Whoever had built this into the floor had known what they were doing. The safe wasn't just sitting there, it was anchored, bolted into the support beams, integrated into the very skeleton of the loft. The wheel lock in the center was the only entry point, no keyhole, no combination dial, just a heavy iron wheel that hadn't been turned in decades. Dalton tried it first with his bare hands. It didn't budge, not even a fraction of an inch. Rust had fused the mechanism, turning it into a single piece of immovable metal. He sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead, and thought. His grandfather had taught him that every machine, no matter how old or broken, could be coaxed back to life. You just had to be patient. You had to listen. So Dalton listened. He tapped the wheel, testing the sound. He examined the edges, looking for weak points, and slowly a plan began to form. On Monday, he returned with supplies: a can of wide 40, a wire brush, a rubber mallet, and a set of old wrenches he'd kept from his days working at the garage in town. Arletta came with him, along with Juniper, who'd skipped school. Dalton didn't have the heart to scold her. They climbed into the loft together, moving carefully, testing each board before putting weight on it. The safe sat waiting, dark and patient. Dalton sprayed the wheel lock with Weird 40, coating every visible seam. The chemical smell filled the air, sharp and industrial. "Now we wait," he said. "How long?" Juniper asked. "However long it takes." They waited an hour. Then Dalton tried the wheel again. Still nothing. He sprayed more oil, worked it into the cracks with the wire brush, tapped the edges with the mallet. The sound echoed through the barn like a heartbeat. Another hour passed. Arletta brought sandwiches, and they ate in silence, sitting on the loft floor like children at a secret meeting. Juniper took photos of the safe, careful not to post them anywhere. Dalton tried the wheel again. This time, he felt something. The tiniest shift, barely perceptible, but it was there. "It moved," he whispered. Arletta leaned closer. "Are you sure?" He tried again, putting his full weight into it. The wheel groaned, metal scraping against metal, and shifted 1/4 of an inch. Dalton's heart leapt. "It's working!" They took turns after that, each of them trying, coaxing, pleading with the old lock. By the time the sun started to set, they'd managed to turn the wheel a full rotation, but it needed more. The mechanism inside was still frozen, still resisting. "We'll come back tomorrow," Dalton said. But as they climbed down from the loft, Dalton felt a sharp pain in his chest. It came fast and fierce, like someone had driven a nail between his ribs. He gasped, grabbing the ladder rung, his vision swimming. "Dal?" Arletta's voice sounded far away. "Dal? What's wrong?" He couldn't answer. The pain radiated down his left arm, and suddenly the ladder felt like it was tilting. He missed the next rung, his boot slipping, and for a horrible moment he thought he was going to fall. But Juniper was there somehow, grabbing his arm, holding him steady. "I got you, Grandpa, I got you." Together she and Arletta helped him down. They sat him on the ground, Arletta's hands on his face, her eyes wide with terror. "Breathe," she said. "Just breathe." Dalton sucked in air, the pain slowly ebbing. It wasn't a heart attack. He knew what those felt like. His brother had died from one 15 years ago. This was something else. Stress, exhaustion, maybe just age reminding him it was still there. "I'm okay," he managed. "You're not," Arletta said, her voice shaking. "We're taking you to the hospital." "No!" "Dal, I said no." He grabbed her hand. "I'm fine. It was just a cramp." She didn't believe him. Neither did Juniper. But they also knew Dalton well enough to know that arguing would get them nowhere. They helped him to the truck, and Arletta drove them home in silence. That night, she made him promise to see a doctor. He promised, even though they both knew he wouldn't. Doctors cost money they didn't have. Instead, Dalton rested. And while he rested, he thought. He thought about the safe, about what might be inside, about what it could mean for them. But he also thought about mortality, about the fact that he was 72 and running out of time, about the dreams he'd carried his whole life and never had the chance to fulfill, about Arletta, who'd given him 51 years of love and loyalty, who deserved more than a leaking trailer and a used thermos of coffee. If that safe held anything at all, he wanted her to have it. The next day, against Arletta's protests, he returned to the barn. This time, he moved slower, listened to his body, rested between efforts. Juniper stayed by his side, ready to catch him if he stumbled. Arletta kept checking his pulse like she was monitoring a ticking bomb. They worked the wheel lock for hours. Spray, brush, tap, turn. Spray, brush, tap, turn. The rhythm became almost meditative, and slowly, inch by inch, the wheel began to cooperate. The rust flaked away, the mechanism inside started to loosen, and by late afternoon, the wheel was turning freely. Dalton sat back, breathing hard. "We're close." "How close?" Juniper asked. "Maybe one more day." That night, word had spread further through Porter's Ridge. Patty stopped by again, this time with her husband, a man named Frank who worked at the feed store. They stood on the trailer steps, awkward and apologetic. "We heard Dalton had some kind of episode at the barn," Frank said. "I'm fine," Dalton called from inside. "Folks are saying you're working yourself to death out there," Patty added. "That maybe it's time to let it go." Arletta stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "We appreciate the concern, but we know what we're doing." "Do you?" Frank asked, not unkindly. "Because from where we're standing, it looks like you're killing yourself over a building that's not worth saving." Arletta's eyes hardened. "It's worth it to us." They left after that, but Dalton could feel the weight of their judgment. The whole town thought they were fools. Maybe they were. But fools with purpose were better than the alternative. On Wednesday, something shifted in Porter's Ridge. A rumor started circulating. Nobody knew where it began, that Dalton and Arletta had found something in the barn. Maybe old coins, maybe antiques, maybe nothing. But the rumor was enough. Suddenly, people were interested. Trucks slowed as they drove past the property. A couple of teenagers tried to sneak onto the land one night, but Dalton heard them and fired a warning shot from his old .22 rifle into the air. They didn't come back. "People are getting nosy," Arletta said. "Let them," Dalton replied. "They'll get bored." But he knew she was right. The clock was ticking. If they were going to open that safe, they needed to do it soon. On Thursday night, Dalton couldn't take it anymore. He drove to the barn alone, just him and his flashlight and his desperation. Arletta had fallen asleep early, exhausted from worry, and he didn't want to wake her. He climbed into the loft, every joint in his body protesting, and approached the safe. The wheel turned smoothly now, all the way around, once, twice, 3 times. He felt the mechanism inside engaging, felt the tumblers shifting. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel and pulled. The door didn't move. He tried again, harder, nothing. "Come on," he whispered, "please." He tried a 4th rotation, then pulled with everything he had. Something deep inside the safe clicked, loud and final, and the door shifted. Just a hair, but it shifted. Dalton's breath caught. He wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, metal grinding against metal, but slowly, impossibly, the door began to open. Light from his flashlight spilled into the interior, and Dalton froze. His heart stopped. His breath stopped. Time itself seemed to stop, because inside that safe, stacked neatly in rows, were bundles, dozens of them, wrapped in old cloth, tied with string, yellowed with age. Dalton reached in with trembling hands and pulled one out. He unwrapped it carefully, and his knees nearly gave out. Cash. $100 bills, old ones, the kind with different faces and designs from another era. He counted quickly. $10,000 in one bundle. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped it. He looked back into the safe. There were more bundles, many more, and beneath them, something else. Small wooden boxes. He pulled one out, opened it. Gold coins, dozens of them, gleaming even under the weak beam of his flashlight. Another box held what looked like bonds, official-looking papers with ornate printing and signatures. Another held stock certificates, old and brittle. Dalton sat back hard, the flashlight falling from his hand and rolling across the floor. He pressed his palms to his face, trying to process what he was seeing, what it meant. This wasn't a few $1,000s hidden away for a rainy day. This was a fortune, an actual fortune. He didn't know how long he sat there, minutes, maybe hours. His mind couldn't hold on to a single thought. It just spun over and over, like the wheel on the safe. Finally, he picked up the flashlight and shone it back into the safe. At the very back, tucked behind the bundles of cash, was an envelope. He reached in and pulled it out. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind people used for important things. His name wasn't on it. Instead, in careful cursive, it read, "To whoever finds this." Dalton's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter written in faded ink. He held it close to the flashlight and began to read. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it back. My name is Elias Grayson, and this barn, this land, has been in my family for 3 generations. I made my fortune in oil rights during the boom, more money than a farmer like me ever thought possible. But I've seen what money does to people. I've seen families torn apart, communities destroyed, good men turned into monsters. When the banks started failing in '29, I pulled everything out. Every dollar, every bond, every ounce of gold. I brought it here to the only place I trusted, my barn. I built this safe myself with my own hands and sealed it into the floor. I told myself I'd use it when the world settled down, when things got better. But they never did. And now I'm dying. The doctors say my heart won't last another year. I don't have children. I don't have heirs. The money will go to the state, to lawyers, to people who'll waste it on things that don't matter. So I'm leaving it here. If you found it, then you were meant to. Use it wisely. Don't let it poison you. And know that somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, an old farmer is glad his work meant something. Elias Grayson, November 1938. Dalton read the letter 3 times. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. Then he looked into the safe one more time, trying to estimate the value. There had to be at least 50 bundles of cash, maybe more. The gold coins alone were probably worth tens of thousands. The bonds and stock certificates, if they were still valid, could be worth even more. He thought about the number Elias had mentioned in the letter, about the oil boom, about what that kind of money could be worth today. And suddenly, a number formed in his mind, a number so big it felt obscene. $275 million, maybe more, maybe less, but somewhere in that range. Dalton pressed his hand to his chest, felt his heart hammering, and wondered if this was how he'd die. Alone in a barn, surrounded by more money than he'd ever dreamed of, his heart finally giving out from the shock. But he didn't die. He just sat there breathing, staring, trying to make sense of the impossible. Finally, he closed the safe door. He didn't lock it, couldn't even if he wanted to. The mechanism was too delicate, too old. but he covered it again with the loose boards, scattered hay over the top, and climbed down from the loft. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Stars filled the sky, endless and indifferent. Dalton stood in the gravel driveway looking up at them and felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He drove home slowly, his mind a fog. When he walked into the trailer, Arletta was awake, sitting at the tiny kitchen table in her bathrobe. She looked up, saw his face, and stood quickly. "Dal, what happened?" He couldn't speak. He just handed her the envelope. She read the letter, her eyes growing wider with each line, and when she finished, she looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Fear and hope tangled together into something unrecognizable. "Is it real?" she whispered. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." She sat down hard, the letter still in her hands. "Oh my God." Dalton pulled out a chair and sat across from her. They stared at each other, two old people in a falling-apart trailer, holding a piece of paper that had just rewritten their entire lives. "What do we do?" Arletta asked. Dalton shook his head. "I don't know." "Do we tell someone?" "Who?" "I don't know. A lawyer? The bank?" "And say what?" Dalton asked. "That we found a fortune in a barn we bought for $300. They'll take it, Lita. They'll find some law, some loophole, some reason why it's not really ours." Arletta's hands trembled. "But what if we keep it and get in trouble? What if it's illegal?" "Elias left it for whoever found it," Dalton said. "We found it. It's ours. You don't know that." "I do," he said firmly. "I feel it." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the secret pressing down on them like stones. Outside, a dog barked. Inside, the refrigerator hummed, and between them, folded on the table, was a letter from a dead man offering them a second chance. "We need to think about this," Arletta finally said. "We need to be smart." Dalton nodded. "We will be." But as he said it, he looked at his wife, at the lines on her face, at the grey in her hair, at the hands that had worked so hard for so long, and he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let this slip away. Not after everything they'd been through. Not after all the years of struggling and surviving and being invisible. This was their moment, and he'd be damned if he let anyone take it from them. The next morning, Dalton called Juniper. "Can you come to the barn?" he asked. "Now?" "If you can." She arrived an hour later, backpack over her shoulder, curiosity written all over her face. "What's going on?" Arletta and Dalton exchanged a look. Then he handed her the letter. Juniper read it slowly, her eyes widening. When she finished, she looked up at them. "You found it? The safe? You opened it?" "Last night," Dalton said. "And?" "It's real," Arletta said quietly. "All of it." Juniper's mouth fell open. "Holy—" "We need your help," Dalton interrupted. "With what?" "Research," he said. "We need to know what we're dealing with. The legal side, the tax side, what we can and can't do. You're good with computers, with finding information." Juniper nodded slowly, still processing. "Okay, yeah, I can do that." "And Juniper," Arletta added, her voice serious. "You can't tell anyone. Not your mom, not your friends, nobody." "I won't," Juniper said. "I promise." They spent the rest of the day in the barn, the three of them, planning. Juniper researched on her phone, taking notes, looking up laws about found property, treasure trove statutes, inheritance, rules. Dalton and Arletta went through the safe again, this time methodically, counting, cataloguing, taking photos. By evening, they had a clearer picture. 53 bundles of cash, each containing $10,000. $530,000 in bills. 218 gold coins, likely worth $50,000 to $60,000. 18 bearer bonds, which Juniper explained could still be redeemed if they were careful. and 42 stock certificates from companies that either no longer existed or had been absorbed into larger corporations. The total conservative estimate was staggering. At least $275 million, possibly more. Dalton sat on the loft floor, surrounded by wealth he'd never imagined, and felt nothing like he thought he would. He didn't feel happy. He didn't feel excited. He felt terrified. Because money like this didn't solve problems. It created them. It brought attention, scrutiny, danger. People had been killed for far less. "We have to be careful," he said quietly. Arletta nodded. "Very careful." Juniper looked at them both. "So, what's the plan?" Dalton took a deep breath. "First, we secure this place. New locks, cameras if we can afford them. Something to keep people out. Second, we figure out the legal way to claim this. Juniper, you'll help with that. And third," he paused, looking at Arletta. "Third, we decide what kind of people we want to be." Arletta reached over and took his hand. "We already know what kind of people we are, Dal. This doesn't change that." But as the sun set over the barn, casting long shadows across the floor, Dalton wasn't so sure, because he'd seen what money did to people. He'd seen families destroyed, friendships ruined, lives consumed, and he knew that no matter how careful they were, no matter how good their intentions, everything was about to change. The only question was whether they could survive it. Dalton didn't sleep for 3 nights. He'd lie in bed beside Arletta, listening to her breathe, and his mind would spin like a broken record. The safe, the money, the letter, Elias Grayson's careful handwriting, the weight of it all pressed down on his chest until he couldn't tell if it was anxiety or his heart finally giving up. On the 4th night, he gave up trying. He sat at the kitchen table in his undershirt and work pants, a cold cup of coffee in front of him, and stared at the letter he'd read 100 times already. "To whoever finds this." But what Elias hadn't written was what to do after you found it. How to carry something this heavy. How to tell the difference between blessing and burden. Arletta shuffled out of the bedroom around 3 in the morning, wrapping her cardigan tighter around her thin frame. She didn't say anything, just sat down across from him and reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold and small, but they anchored him. "We can't keep living like this," she said quietly. "This secret, it's eating you alive." "I know. So, what do we do?" Dalton rubbed his face, the stubble on his jaw scratching against his palms. Juniper found a lawyer, 3 towns over, guy named Martin Hollis, supposed to be good, discreet. "Can we trust him?" "I don't know," Dalton admitted. "But we have to trust someone." Arletta nodded slowly. "Then we call him." The appointment was set for Tuesday afternoon. Dalton wore his only button-up shirt, the one he'd bought for his grandson's funeral 8 years ago. Arletta wore a dress she'd had since 1995, faded blue with small white flowers. They looked like what they were, old, poor, and desperately out of their depth. Martin Hollis's office was in a 2-story building above a hardware store. The waiting room smelled like old carpet and lemon cleaner. A secretary with kind eyes offered them coffee, which they declined, too nervous to drink anything. When Martin finally called them back, Dalton's hands were shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. Martin was younger than Dalton expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, which somehow made Dalton feel better. This wasn't some slick city lawyer. This was someone who understood people like them. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," Martin said, gesturing to 2 chairs across from his desk. "Please sit. I understand you have a rather unusual situation." Dalton and Arletta exchanged a glance. Then Dalton pulled out the folder Juniper had helped them prepare. Inside were photos of the safe, copies of the letter, documentation of their property purchase, and a detailed inventory of what they'd found. Martin opened the folder and began reading. His expression didn't change, didn't reveal anything, but Dalton noticed his eyes widening slightly when he reached the estimated value. After several minutes, Martin looked up. "This is real?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Dalton said. "You purchased the property legally?" "Paid $300 at county auction. Got the deed." Martin nodded slowly, flipping through the documents again. "And you're certain no one else knows about this?" "Just our granddaughter," Arletta said. "She helped us research." "Good," Martin said. "That's very good." He leaned back in his chair and studied them. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed, I'm going to be completely honest with you. What you've found is legally yours. Under property law, when you purchase real estate, you acquire everything within and attached to that property unless explicitly excluded in the sale. This safe was built into the structure, which makes it part of the real estate. The contents belong to you." Dalton felt his chest loosen for the first time in days. "So we're not going to get in trouble?" "Not from a legal standpoint," Martin said. "However, there are significant tax implications. The IRS will consider this found property as income. You'll need to report it and pay taxes accordingly." "How much?" Arletta asked, her voice small. Martin did some quick calculations on a notepad. "Rough estimate, federal and state combined, you're looking at around 40%, possibly more depending on how the assets are valued." 40%. Dalton's mind reeled. That still left them with over $100 million, but the thought of handing that much money to the government made him feel sick. "There are ways to minimize the burden," Martin continued. "Charitable foundations, trusts, strategic gifting, but that requires planning and time." "We don't want to hide it," Dalton said firmly. "We want to do this right." Martin smiled. "Then you're already ahead of most people who find themselves in your position." They spent the next 2 hours going over options. Martin explained the process of authenticating the currency, redeeming the bearer bonds, evaluating the gold coins. He talked about setting up a trust to protect them from lawsuits and scammers. He outlined a timeline, 6 to 8 months before everything was properly processed and they could actually access the money. By the time they left his office, Dalton's head was spinning. They sat in the truck for a long moment, neither of them speaking. Finally, Arletta turned to him. 8 months, she said. "I heard." "We can last 8 months." Dalton looked at her, at the woman who'd stood by him through 51 years of struggle, and felt his throat tighten. "Lita, what do we do with it? When it's ours, really ours, what do we do?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We help people, the way someone should have helped us." He reached over and kissed her forehead. Yeah, we do." But keeping the secret for 8 months proved harder than they imagined. Word had already spread through Porter's Ridge that Dalton and Arletta were up to something at the barn. People saw them coming and going at odd hours, saw Juniper's car parked there on weekends, saw Martin Hollis drive out once to inspect the property. Rumors multiplied like weeds. At the diner one morning, Dalton overheard 2 men talking in the booth behind him. "Heard Reed found something valuable out there. Old tools, maybe, antiques." "Nah, I heard it was gold, like a prospector's stash." "Whatever it is, they're keeping it secret. That's suspicious." Dalton kept his eyes on his coffee, but his appetite disappeared. Arletta squeezed his knee under the table, a silent reminder to stay calm. Patty stopped by the trailer again, this time without her husband. She looked worried. "Dalton, Arletta, people are talking," she said from the doorstep. "They're saying you found something in that barn, something valuable." "People talk too much," Dalton replied. "I know, but, well, there are some folks who think you're hiding something that maybe belongs to the county or the state." Arletta stepped forward. "We're not hiding anything illegal, Patty, I promise you that." "I believe you," Patty said quickly. "I just thought you should know what's being said." After she left, Arletta turned to Dalton. "This is getting out of control." "I know." We need to tell people something, anything, before they make up something worse. Dalton knew she was right, but what could they say? The truth would bring chaos. Lies would make things worse. They were trapped in a silence of their own making. Juniper had a different idea. She showed up on Friday evening with a laptop and a determined expression. "We need to control the narrative," she said, setting up at their kitchen table. "Control what?" Dalton asked. "The story. Right now, people are making up whatever they want about you guys. So let's give them something real, something that's true but doesn't reveal everything." "Like what?" Juniper typed quickly. "We say you found historical documents in the barn, papers from the original owner, stuff about the oil boom in the 20s. You're working with a historian to preserve them and maybe donate them to the county archive." Arletta blinked. "That's not entirely a lie." "Exactly," Juniper said. "It explains why you've been protective of the site, why a lawyer's involved, and why you're being careful. People love local history stuff. It takes the mystery out of it without exposing what you really found." Dalton considered this. It was smart, maybe too smart, but it could work. "Okay," he said, "let's try it." Juniper drafted a short statement and posted it on the local community Facebook group, which Dalton didn't even know existed until that moment. Within an hour, the comments started rolling in. Most were positive, curious, supportive. A few were skeptical. But the wild speculation died down. For a few weeks, things were almost normal. Dalton and Arletta continued visiting the barn, though now they were more careful. The safe remained hidden under the hay, untouched except for the times Martin needed to document something. They met with accountants, tax specialists, appraisers. Slowly, piece by piece, the machinery of legitimacy began to turn. And then, one night in late September, Dalton made a decision. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in his mind like a stone. They didn't need $275 million. They didn't need a fraction of that. What they needed was enough to live comfortably, to stop worrying about rent and propane and whether the truck would start in the morning. The rest, all that impossible wealth, it needed to go somewhere it could do actual good. He talked to Arletta about it first. They sat on the porch of the trailer, watching the sun set over the distant hills, and he laid out his idea. "We keep enough for us," he said. "A house, nothing fancy, just something with a real roof and working heat. Enough to cover medical bills, help Juniper with college. Maybe $1 million, $2 million at most." Arletta listened, her face unreadable. "The rest," he continued, "we give away, not all at once, not recklessly, but strategically. Medical debt forgiveness for families in the area, scholarship funds, small business grants, things that actually change lives." Arletta was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You really want to do this?" "I do." "People will think we're crazy." "People already think we're crazy." She smiled. That soft, sad smile he'd fallen in love with 51 years ago. "Then let's be crazy together." They started small. Martin helped them set up an anonymous charitable fund. The first donation went to Porter's Ridge Regional Hospital, $25,000 earmarked specifically for medical debt forgiveness. No names, no press release, just a check that showed up in the billing department with instructions to apply it to families who couldn't afford their bills. The hospital administrator called Martin's office, confused and grateful. "Who's behind this?" "A donor who wishes to remain anonymous," Martin replied. 3 families had their debts erased that month. One was a young couple whose daughter had been born premature and spent 2 months in NICU. Another was an elderly man who'd had a stroke and couldn't afford rehabilitation. The third was a woman who'd survived breast cancer but was drowning in treatment costs. Word spread quickly, not about who gave the money, but about the fact that it had been given. People started talking about the mystery donor, speculating, guessing. Was it a wealthy businessman, a lottery winner, someone from out of town with local ties? Dalton heard the conversations at the gas station, at the diner, at the post office. He said nothing, just smiled and nodded and went about his day. The second donation went to Porter's Ridge Elementary School. The arts program had been cut 3 years ago due to budget constraints. Music, theater, painting, all gone. Dalton and Arletta gave $50,000 to reinstate it, buy new instruments, hire teachers, again anonymous, again no press. Just a check and a note that said, "For the children." The principal cried when she opened the envelope. She called an emergency school board meeting. Parents celebrated. Kids who'd never held an instrument got to play guitar, piano, drums. The school hallways filled with music again. And still, no one knew. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The third donation was personal. The Porter's Ridge Community Center had been on the verge of closing for 5 years. It was the only place in town where kids could go after school, where seniors gathered for lunch, where AIR meetings happened and youth basketball leagues played. The building was falling apart, the roof leaked, the furnace barely worked, and the county refused to fund repairs. Dalton and Arletta gave $200,000, enough to fix everything and keep it running for years. When the community center director, a woman named Louise, received the donation, she sobbed so hard she had to sit down. She didn't know who to thank, so she stood in the empty gymnasium and said thank you to the air, hoping whoever had saved her life's work could somehow hear. By November, the town was buzzing. 5 anonymous donations in 3 months, over $300,000 total. Everyone had theories. Some thought it was a guilt-ridden politician. Others believed it was an inheritance from someone who'd left Porter's Ridge and never forgotten it. A few cynics thought it was a scam, that the money would be taken back somehow. Dalton watched it all unfold with a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because they were actually doing it, making a difference, changing lives. Fear because secrets this big never stayed buried forever. Arletta bought groceries one afternoon and overheard 2 women talking in the checkout line. Whoever this donor is, they're an angel. Or they're trying to buy good publicity before something bad comes out. Arletta set her items on the conveyor belt, her hands trembling slightly. The women didn't recognize her, didn't know they were standing 3 feet from the answer to their questions. At home, she told Dalton what she'd heard. Some people think we're criminals. Let them think what they want, he said. We know the truth. But it bothered him more than he admitted. All his life, he'd been invisible, overlooked, dismissed, and now, even when doing good, people suspected the worst. It was a special kind of cruelty. Juniper noticed the strain. She came over on a Saturday morning and found her grandparents sitting in silence, the weight of their secret pulling them down like anchors. You need to tell people, she said. Not everything, but something. This is killing you. We can't, Dalton said. Not yet. Martin said. I know what Martin said, but look at you. You're miserable. You're hiding in your own town. We're trying to do the right thing, Arletta said softly. I know, Juniper replied, sitting between them. And you are. But you don't have to do it alone. That night, Dalton drove out to the barn. He hadn't been there in weeks, too busy with lawyers and paperwork and donations. He climbed into the loft, moved the hay aside, and looked at the safe. The door was closed but not locked, the wheel lock frozen in place. He sat down beside it and ran his hand over the rusted metal. You knew, didn't you? He said to the ghost of Elias Grayson. You knew how heavy this would be. The barn creaked in response, wood settling, the past speaking in its own language. Dalton thought about everything that had happened since he'd opened that safe. The fear, the sleepless nights, the constant looking over his shoulder. But he also thought about the families whose medical bills had been erased, the kids playing instruments again, the community center that wouldn't have to close. And he realized something important. The weight wasn't the money. The weight was the responsibility of what to do with it, and that was a weight worth carrying. By December, the donations had reached $600,000. A dozen families helped, 3 community programs saved, and still, Porter's Ridge had no idea who was behind it. But cracks were starting to show. A reporter from the county newspaper, a woman named Cassidy Oakes, started investigating. She was young, ambitious, and good at her job. She began connecting dots, asking questions, following paper trails. She showed up at the trailer one cold afternoon, notepad in hand, camera around her neck. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," she asked, when Arletta answered the door. "Yes?" "I'm Cassidy Oakes with the Porter's Ridge Chronicle. I'm doing a story on the anonymous donor who's been helping families in town. I was hoping to ask you a few questions." Arletta's heart jumped into her throat. "I don't know anything about that." "No?" Cassidy smiled, but it wasn't unkind. "Funny, because I've been tracking property records and financial transactions, and your name keeps coming up adjacent to some interesting lawyers and accountants." "We're not talking to reporters," Dalton said, appearing behind Arletta. "I understand," Cassidy said, "but people are curious. They want to thank whoever's been helping them. Don't you think they deserve to know?" "No," Dalton said firmly. "I think they deserve help, and that's what they're getting." Cassidy studied him for a moment. "You found something in that barn, didn't you? Something valuable." Dalton's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "We found old documents, historical papers. Already told folks that." "Right," Cassidy said, clearly not buying it. "And those papers somehow generated $600,000 in charitable donations?" "You need to leave," Arletta said, her voice shaking. Cassidy handed them a business card. "When you're ready to tell the truth, call me. People are going to find out eventually. Better it comes from you than from rumors." She left, and Dalton closed the door. He and Arletta stood in the narrow hallway of the trailer, staring at each other, the walls suddenly feeling much smaller. "She knows," Arletta whispered. "She suspects," Dalton corrected. "That's different." But 2 days later, someone spray-painted their trailer. Dalton woke up to find the words, "Share the Wealth," in bright red letters across the aluminum siding. His hands shook as he tried to scrub it off, but the paint had seeped into the porous metal. It wouldn't come off. Arletta cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks as she stood in the cold morning air, staring at the vandalism. "They think we're hoarding it," she said. "They think we're selfish." "They don't know anything," Dalton said, but his voice lacked conviction. Juniper drove over as soon as she heard. She took pictures of the graffiti, posted about it online, and within hours people were offering to help. Some brought paint to cover it, others offered to file police reports. But Dalton knew the damage wasn't just to the trailer. It was to their peace, their safety, their sense of home. That night, he called Martin Hollis. "We need to tell people, soon. This is getting out of control." Martin was quiet for a moment. "The paperwork's almost done. Another month, maybe 6 weeks. Can you hold out that long?" Dalton looked at Arletta, at the exhaustion in her eyes, at the way her hands trembled. "I don't know." "Then let's speed things up," Martin said. "I'll file emergency motions, push the appraisers, get the IRS to expedite. We'll get you to a point where you can go public safely." "How soon?" 2 weeks, Martin promised. "Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks felt like 2 years. More graffiti appeared, this time on the barn itself. Someone broke into the property one night and smashed windows, tore down fencing, scattered trash across the field. Dalton installed cameras, but the damage was done. The place he'd bought to rebuild had become a target. People in town split into camps. Some defended Dalton and Arletta, saying they were good people being harassed. Others whispered that they must be hiding something criminal. Why else all the secrecy? The divide cut through families, friendships, the very fabric of the community. And through it all, Dalton and Arletta kept giving. Another 100,000 to a Veterans Assistance Fund, 50,000 to the local food bank, 25,000 to a family whose house had burned down. They gave because it was the only thing that made sense anymore, the only thing that felt right in a world that had turned hostile and strange. Finally, on a grey morning in mid-January, Martin called. "It's done. The paperwork's finalized. The IRS has cleared everything. You're legally in the clear." Dalton felt like he could breathe for the first time in months. "So we can tell people." "You can tell people," Martin confirmed. "In fact, I'd recommend it. Sooner rather than later." Dalton hung up and turned to Arletta. She was standing by the window, looking out at the frozen fields beyond their trailer. "It's time," he said. She nodded without turning around. "I know." They called Juniper first, then Martin. Together, they drafted a plan. No newspaper interviews, no press conferences, just the truth, delivered simply, to the people who deserved to hear it most. Dalton made a phone call to the community center to Louise and asked if he could use the gymnasium for a town meeting. She agreed immediately, curiosity clear in her voice. Posters went up around Porter's Ridge. "Community meeting, Wednesday 7 p.m., important announcement." People speculated wildly. Some thought the mystery donor would reveal themselves. Others thought the town council was making some kind of decision. Nobody guessed the truth. On Wednesday evening, the gymnasium filled. Over 200 people showed up, cramming onto bleachers and folding chairs, standing along the walls. The energy was electric, nervous, expectant. Dalton stood at the back with Arletta and Juniper, watching the crowd gather. His heart hammered in his chest. Arletta squeezed his hand. "You sure about this?" she whispered. "No," he admitted, "but we're doing it anyway." At 7:05, they walked to the front of the gymnasium. The crowd fell silent. Dalton stood behind a single microphone, Arletta on one side, Juniper on the other. He looked out at the faces, some familiar, some not, some kind, some angry. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I know there's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of rumors, so I'm here to tell you the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath. Dalton pulled out the letter, now encased in a protective sleeve, and held it up. 4 months ago, my wife and I bought the old Grayson barn at county auction. We paid $300 for it. We planned to fix it up, maybe restore it, but what we found inside changed everything. He told them about the loft, the hidden safe, the bundles of cash and gold. He told them about Elias Grayson's letter, about the oil boom, about a farmer who didn't trust banks and hid his fortune. He explained the legal process, the lawyers, the taxes, the long months of waiting, and then he told them about the money. $275 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. People gasped, whispered. Some laughed in disbelief. Dalton waited for the noise to die down. "Now I know what some of you are thinking," he continued, "that we kept it all for ourselves, that we've been living high while the rest of you struggle. But that's not true. Look around this room. Look at this community center, saved from closing. Look at your kids in school, playing instruments again. Look at the families whose medical bills disappeared, whose businesses got a second chance." His voice grew stronger. "We've been giving it away, anonymously, quietly, because we didn't want attention. We wanted impact." Arletta stepped forward. "We're not rich people," she said softly. "We're the same folks we've always been. We just happened to find something and we decided to share it." The gymnasium erupted. Some people stood and applauded, others shouted questions, a few just sat in stunned silence. Dalton raised his hand, asking for quiet. "We're not done," he said. "We're setting up a foundation, the Elias Grayson Legacy Fund. It'll keep supporting this community for generations. Scholarships, emergency assistance, small business grants, whatever people need." He paused. "And we're restoring the barn, turning it into a community heritage center and museum. A place that tells the story of Porter's Ridge, of Elias, of all of us. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from the back, someone started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. The applause grew, filling the gymnasium, washing over Dalton and Arletta like a wave. Tears streamed down Arletta's face. Juniper wrapped her arms around both of them. Dalton looked out at the crowd and saw something he hadn't expected. Not judgment, not anger, but gratitude. Maybe even hope. After the meeting, people lined up to shake their hands, to hug them, to thank them. Some apologized for the graffiti, for the suspicion, for doubting them. Others just cried. Louise, the community center director, held Arletta for a full minute, whispering thank you over and over. Cassidy Oakes, the reporter, approached with her camera off. "That was quite a story," she said. "You going to write about it?" Dalton asked. "Only if you want me to," she replied. "This is your story to tell, not mine." He nodded. "Maybe someday. But not yet." She smiled and walked away. By the time they left, it was past 10. They drove home in silence, exhausted, drained, but somehow lighter. The trailer looked different now, smaller but not in a bad way, just temporary. A place they'd stayed while waiting for something better. Inside, Dalton made them both tea. They sat at the tiny kitchen table, the same table where they'd read Elias's letter all those months ago, and just breathed. "You think we did the right thing?" Arletta asked. Dalton reached across and took her hand. "I think Elias would be proud." The weeks following the town meeting felt like living in a different world. Dalton and Arletta had expected backlash, lawsuits, maybe even threats. Instead, they got something stranger. Acceptance. People they'd never spoken to stopped them in the grocery store to shake their hands. Teenagers working at the gas station refused to let them pay. Someone left a homemade apple pie on their doorstep with a note that simply said, "Thank you for believing in us." But not everyone was convinced. On a Thursday morning, Dalton walked into Mabel's diner for his usual coffee and found Benny Cartwright sitting in his regular booth, arms crossed, face hard. Benny, the same contractor who'd mocked him at the auction, who'd laughed when Dalton bought the barn. "Reed," Benny called out. "Got a minute?" Dalton hesitated, then slid into the booth across from him. Mabel brought coffee without asking, her eyes nervous. "You believe this guy?" Benny said to the room, though he was looking at Dalton. "Buys a barn for pocket change, and suddenly he's the town's savior." "I'm not trying to be anyone's savior," Dalton said quietly. "No?" Benny leaned forward. "Then what are you trying to be? Because from where I'm sitting, you got lucky, plain and simple, found something that wasn't yours, and now you're playing hero with it." "It was legally ours," Dalton said. "Lawyer confirmed it." "Lawyer you paid with that money," Benny shot back. "Convenient." The diner had gone quiet. People were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Dalton felt his chest tighten, but Arletta's words echoed in his mind. "We know the truth." "Believe what you want, Benny," Dalton said, standing up. "But that money's going to help people whether you like it or not." He left cash on the table for the coffee he hadn't touched and walked out. His hands shook as he climbed into his truck, but he didn't regret a word. Some people would never understand, and that was okay. He wasn't doing this for them. Arletta was waiting at the barn when he arrived. Over the past month, they'd started the restoration in earnest. Martin had helped them hire a contractor, not Benny, someone from 2 counties over who specialized in historic preservation. The barn was now wrapped in scaffolding, the roof being replaced panel by panel, the foundation reinforced with steel and concrete. It no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a project with purpose. Juniper was there too, along with 3 other teenagers from her school. They'd volunteered to help clean the interior, catalog old tools, prepare the space for what it would become. Dalton watched them work, their laughter echoing off the old walls, and felt something shift in his chest. They don't see us as old, broke people anymore, Arletta said, walking up beside him. No, he agreed. They see us as people who did something. Is that better or worse? Dalton thought about it. Different. Just different. By February, the barn transformation was undeniable. The sagging roof had been replaced with new timber and tin, historically accurate but structurally sound. The walls had been reinforced, the windows restored, the dirt floor covered with reclaimed wood planks. Inside, display cases were being built, exhibit spaces mapped out, a small theater area designed for community presentations. It was becoming exactly what Dalton had dreamed, a place that honored the past while serving the present. The safe itself had been carefully removed from the loft, restored by a specialist, and would be the centerpiece of the museum. Empty now, its door propped open, it stood as a testament to secrets kept and finally shared. Beside it would be Elias Grayson's letter, framed and protected, telling the story of a farmer who didn't trust the world with his fortune, but trusted the future to do better. One afternoon, a man Dalton didn't recognize showed up at the construction site. He was in his 60s, tall and thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a worn leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Thomas Grayson, Elias's great-nephew. "I heard about what you found," Thomas said, "and what you're doing with it." Dalton tensed, expecting anger, maybe a lawsuit. Instead, Thomas smiled. "My family thought that money was lost forever. After Elias died, there were rumors he'd hidden something, but no one could ever find it. We assumed it was just stories." Thomas looked around at the barn, at the work being done. He would have wanted this. He always said the town took care of him, and he should take care of the town. "You're not upset we kept it?" Arletta asked carefully. Thomas shook his head. "Legally, it's yours. Morally, you're doing exactly what he hoped someone would. I'm just glad it was people like you who found it." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out an old photograph, faded and cracked. It showed a young Elias standing in front of the barn, maybe 30 years old, holding a wrench and grinning. "I thought you might want this for the museum." Dalton took the photo with trembling hands. "Thank you." Thomas stayed for an hour, sharing stories about Elias, about the oil boom, about a man who made a fortune but never forgot where he came from. When he left, he shook their hands and said something that stayed with Dalton for weeks. "You didn't just find his money, you found his heart." March brought the first major donation request. A woman named Claire Martinez walked into Martin Hollis's office with a folder full of medical bills. Her son, 7 years old, needed a surgery the insurance company had denied. Experimental, they called it. Too risky. The cost was $250,000, money Claire would never have in her lifetime. She'd heard about the foundation, about the anonymous help being given, and she was desperate. Martin called Dalton that evening. "We have a request. It's significant." Dalton listened as Martin explained. When he finished, Dalton didn't hesitate. "Help her." "It's a lot of money," Martin cautioned. "We have a lot of money," Dalton replied. "Help her." The check was cut the next day. Claire Martinez's son had his surgery 2 weeks later. Successful, life-changing, saving. When Claire tried to find out who'd paid for it, she hit a wall of legal privacy, so she did the only thing she could think of. She stood on the steps of the community center and shouted thank you to the sky, tears streaming down her face, hoping whoever had saved her son could somehow hear. Dalton heard about it from Louise. He didn't tell Claire it was him. He didn't need to. The thanks was enough. But the requests kept coming. A single father whose house had burned down, a veteran who couldn't afford a wheelchair, a young woman trying to escape an abusive relationship but with no money for a security deposit. Each story broke Dalton's heart and strengthened his resolve. The foundation processed each request carefully, verifying need, ensuring legitimacy, and then quietly, efficiently helped. By April, they'd given away over $3 million. The impact rippled through Porter's Ridge like stones dropped in still water. Families stabilized, businesses stayed open. Kids went to college who never thought they could. The town, which had been slowly dying for decades, started to breathe again. Cassidy Oakes wrote a story for the county newspaper, but not the one Dalton expected. Instead of focusing on the money, she focused on the people being helped. She interviewed families, business owners, teachers. She painted a picture of a community being rebuilt from the inside out, not by government programs or corporate investment, but by two elderly people who'd chosen to care. The story went viral. Within days, news outlets from across the state were calling. National media wanted interviews. Producers floated television specials. Dalton and Arletta refused it all. "We're not the story," Dalton told Martin. "The people we're helping, they're the story." But saying no to the media didn't stop the attention. Tour buses started showing up, people wanting to see the famous barn, to glimpse the couple who'd found millions and given it away. Dalton had to install a fence and hire security, something that made him deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't supposed to be a spectacle. One morning, he found a young man sitting on the hood of his truck outside the trailer. The guy was maybe 25, thin, with hollow eyes and a backpack that looked like it held everything he owned. "You Dalton Reed?" the man asked. "I am." "I heard you help people." Dalton studied him. "What do you need?" The young man's voice cracked. "I need to believe that good people still exist." They talked for 2 hours. The man's name was Marcus. He'd lost his job, his apartment, his girlfriend in rapid succession. He'd been living out of his car for 3 months, bouncing between Walmart parking lots and rest stops. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for hope. Dalton didn't give him cash. Instead, he made some calls. By the end of the day, Marcus had a job interview at the hardware store, a room at a boarding house paid for a month in advance, and a connection to a counselor who could help him get back on his feet. Marcus cried in the truck, his face in his hands, his whole body shaking. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why do you care?" Dalton looked at him. "Because 6 months ago, I was invisible. People looked right through me. I know what that feels like." Marcus nodded slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Dalton said. "Just pass it on when you can." By May, the barn was nearly finished. The grand opening was scheduled for June 12th, a date chosen because it was Elias Grayson's birthday. Invitations went out to everyone in Porter's Ridge, plus Thomas Grayson, state historians, preservation societies, and select media who'd agreed to cover the story respectfully. Dalton and Arletta spent weeks preparing, working with Juniper to curate exhibits, arrange artifacts, write placards explaining the history. The centerpiece was the safe, of course, but around it they'd built something larger. A timeline of Porter's Ridge, showing its growth from farmland to a small industrial town to its current quiet existence. They'd collected oral histories from longtime residents, photos from family albums, tools and equipment from closed businesses. The barn wasn't just about Elias anymore. It was about everyone who'd ever called this place home. Arletta designed a section called Voices of the Ridge, where community members could record their own stories, their struggles, their triumphs. She wanted people to know they mattered, that their lives were worth documenting. The first recording was from Louise, the community center director, talking about what it meant to serve a town everyone else had forgotten. Dalton's favorite part was a small reading nook in the corner, filled with comfortable chairs and shelves of books about local history, farming, the oil boom. Juniper had suggested it. "People need a place to sit and think," she'd said, "not just look." She was right. The barn wasn't a museum. It was a sanctuary. 3 days before the opening, Dalton's chest pains came back. He was lifting a box of old photographs when the pain hit, sharp and consuming, radiating down his arm. He dropped the box and grabbed the workbench, his vision swimming. "Dal," Arletta's voice sounded far away. "Dal, talk to me." He tried to speak, but couldn't. His knees buckled. Arletta screamed for Juniper, who called 911. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. By then, the pain had subsided, leaving Dalton weak and terrified. They took him to Porter's Ridge Regional, the same hospital they'd donated to months ago. The emergency room doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, examined him thoroughly. "Mr. Reed, you've had a cardiac event," she said. "Not a full heart attack, but a warning. Your heart is telling you to slow down." "I can't," Dalton said. "The opening is in 3 days." "The opening will happen with or without you," the doctor replied. "But if you don't rest, there might not be a you to see it." Arletta sat beside his bed, holding his hand so tightly it hurt. "You're resting," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I don't care if the president himself shows up. You're resting." Dalton wanted to fight, but he was too tired. He stayed in the hospital overnight for observation. The doctors ran tests, adjusted his medications, and lectured him about stress and age and taking care of himself. He listened mostly. What he thought about, lying in that sterile room, was how much time he had left. He was 72. Arletta was 70. They weren't young. This journey they'd started might outlive them. "Lita," he said in the dark, "what happens to the foundation when we're gone?" She didn't answer right away. "Juniper," she finally said, "and the board we're building, the legacy won't die with us." "Promise?" "I promise." He was released the next morning with strict orders to rest. He lasted approximately 4 hours before he was back at the barn, sitting in a chair Arletta had set up for him, directing the final preparations like a general from his throne. Juniper rolled her eyes but didn't argue. They all knew Dalton would work until he couldn't anymore. It was who he was. The night before the grand opening, the three of them sat in the completed barn, lights off, just the glow of twilight through the new windows. The space was beautiful, warm, full of stories and soul. Dalton looked around and felt tears burn his eyes. "We did it," he whispered. "We did," Arletta agreed. Juniper leaned against her grandmother's shoulder. "Grandpa, when you bought this place, did you ever imagine this?" Dalton laughed softly. "Baby, I imagined fixing a roof and maybe planting a garden. I never imagined any of this." "Do you regret it?" He thought about the question, the stress, the fear, the sleepless nights, the chest pains, the judgment, the attention. And then he thought about Claire Martinez's son, running and playing, about Marcus getting his life back, about the music in the elementary school, the saved community center, the families who could breathe again. "Not for a second," he said. June 12th dawned clear and warm. By 8 in the morning, people were already gathering. The parking area Dalton had graded could hold 40 cars, and it filled by 9. People parked along the road, walked from town, arrived in groups. By 10, when the doors were scheduled to open, nearly 300 people had shown up. State representatives, historians, journalists, locals, and strangers who'd heard the story and wanted to witness it. Dalton stood at the entrance in his best shirt, Arletta beside him in a dress Juniper had bought her, something floral and light that made her look younger. Juniper wore slacks and a blazer, looking professional and proud. Together, they cut a simple ribbon strung across the barn doors. The crowd applauded, cameras flashed, and the Whitaker Heritage Center and Museum officially opened. People poured inside, gasping at the transformation. The old barn that had been a joke, a death trap, a waste of money, now stood as something magnificent. The exhibits were clear and engaging, the artifacts well preserved, the story compellingly told. Children ran to the safe, pressing their faces against the protective glass, imagining what it must have been like to find it full of treasure. Adults lingered over photographs, recognizing faces, remembering stories. Louise brought the entire community center senior group, 40 people who'd thought they'd lose their gathering place. They walked through the exhibits with tears streaming down their faces, Not from sadness, but from being seen, from having their lives documented, preserved, honored. Thomas Grayson gave a short speech about his great-uncle, about a man who believed communities mattered more than individuals, about legacy measured not in dollars, but in lives touched. Then he thanked Dalton and Arletta for proving Elias right. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the rafters. Dalton was asked to speak, and he approached the microphone they'd set up near the safe with shaking hands. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, and took a deep breath. "I bought this barn because I was old and foolish and desperate to believe I still mattered," he began. "I didn't expect to find millions of dollars. I didn't expect to become someone people talked about. I just wanted to fix something broken." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But what I learned is that broken things are worth fixing, not just buildings, but people, communities, hope. Everyone in this room has been broken at some point, by life, by loss, by a world that tells us we're not enough, but we are enough. And when we help each other, we become more than enough." His voice cracked. Arletta squeezed his hand. "Elias Grayson left us more than money. He left us a reminder that what we build matters, that what we give away lasts longer than what we keep, and that sometimes the people who are overlooked, written off, dismissed, those are the people who change everything." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "So thank you for coming today. Thank you for believing in this place, and thank you for proving that Porter's Ridge isn't dying, it's just getting started." The applause was deafening. People stood, whistled, cheered. Dalton stepped back from the microphone and felt Arletta's arms around him. They held each other while the barn erupted around them, and for the first time in months, Dalton felt peace. After the speeches, people explored the museum. The Voices of the Ridge exhibit drew crowds, with people lining up to record their own stories. Dalton overheard a woman talking about working in the textile mill that closed in 2005, how she'd never thought her story mattered until now. A man recorded a memory of his grandfather farming this land in the 50s before the oil boom, when life was hard but communities were tight. By afternoon, the barn was still full. Families picnicked on the lawn. Kids played in the field Dalton had cleared. Teenagers took selfies in front of the safe. It wasn't just an opening. It was a celebration of history, of resilience, of second chances. Benny Cartwright showed up around 3, standing awkwardly near the entrance. Dalton saw him and walked over. "Benny?" "Read." Benny looked around, his expression unreadable. This is something." "Thanks." "I was wrong," Benny said suddenly. "About you, about all of it. You did something good here." Dalton extended his hand. After a moment, Benny shook it. "We all get things wrong sometimes," Dalton said. Benny nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Arletta had watched the exchange from across the room. She smiled at her husband and he smiled back. Forgiveness, even small gestures of it, still mattered. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned. Dalton and Arletta sat on the front steps of the barn, watching the last visitors trickle out. Juniper was inside, helping volunteers clean up. Martin Hollis stopped by to say goodbye. "You did good, Dalton," he said. "Both of you. Couldn't have done it without you." "Sure you could have," Martin replied. "Might have taken longer, might have been messier, but you'd have found a way. People like you always do." He drove off, and Dalton leaned back against the barn wall, exhausted but content. Arletta rested her head on his shoulder. "What now?" she asked. "Now we keep going," he said. "Keep helping, keep building." "For how long?" "As long as we can." Over the next few months, the foundation grew beyond anything they'd imagined. The initial donations had been tactical, targeted, personal. But word spread, and requests poured in from across the state. Medical bills, educational needs, business rescues, emergency housing. Dalton and Arletta assembled a board of directors, people they trusted to carry the mission forward. They hired a full-time administrator, a woman named Patricia, who'd worked in non-profit management for 20 years. Slowly, carefully, they built infrastructure that could outlast them. By August, they'd given away $18 million. By October, $25 million. Not recklessly, not without vetting, but generously. Every dollar went to someone who needed it, someone who'd been overlooked or written off or told they didn't matter. The foundation also launched a small business grant program, offering $10,000 grants to anyone in the county with a solid plan and determination. The first recipient was Marcus, the young man Dalton had met outside his trailer. He wanted to start a mobile mechanic service for people who couldn't afford shop rates. With the grant, he bought tools, a used van, and insurance. 6 months later, he had 12 regular clients and was breaking even. The second recipient was a woman named Angela, who wanted to open a bakery in the empty storefront on Main Street. Her cakes were legendary at church functions, but she'd never had capital to go commercial. The grant changed that. By November, Angela's bakery was the most popular spot in town, creating jobs and filling the air with the smell of fresh bread. One by one, the empty storefronts on Main Street began to fill. A used bookstore, a coffee shop, a small art gallery. Porter's Ridge, which had been fading for decades, started to pulse with life again. People who'd left came back. Young families moved in, attracted by affordable housing and a community that actually cared. The elementary school added a second-grade classroom for the first time in 15 years. Dalton and Arletta watched it all with quiet amazement. They'd set out to fix a barn. Instead, they'd helped fix a town. But the work took its toll. Dalton's chest pains became more frequent. He added more medications, saw more doctors, slowed down as much as his stubborn heart would allow. Arletta developed arthritis in her hands, making even simple tasks painful. They were aging visibly and rapidly, and they knew it. In November, they made a decision. They would move out of the trailer. Not into a mansion, not into something ostentatious, but into a modest house on 2 acres just outside town. 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a porch that wrapped around the front. It cost $200,000, a fraction of what they could afford. But it was perfect. Juniper helped them move, along with a dozen volunteers from town. People who'd been helped by the foundation showed up with trucks and boxes and willingness to give back. By Thanksgiving, Dalton and Arletta were settled into their new home. It had heating that worked, windows that didn't leak, and a bathtub big enough to actually sit in. Arletta cried the first time she soaked in it, not from sadness, but from the sheer luxury of warmth. They hosted Thanksgiving dinner there, the first holiday meal in their own home in 7 years. Juniper came with her mum, Dalton's daughter Sharon, who'd been skeptical of the whole barn project but had come around. Patricia from the foundation came, along with Martin and his wife Louise from the community center, Thomas Grayson and his family. 20 people crammed around a table built from reclaimed barnwood, sharing food and stories and gratitude. Dalton said grace, his voice shaking but strong. "We're thankful for second chances, for broken things made whole, and for people who see past what we were to what we could become." Everyone said amen. On December 15th, Dalton turned 73. The town threw him a birthday party at the Heritage Center, which had become the de facto gathering place for everything important. Over 100 people showed up. Claire Martinez brought her son, now running and healthy, to hug Dalton and thank him again. Marcus gave him a tool set he'd restored himself. Angela from the bakery made a cake shaped like the barn. Arletta stood beside her husband, watching him blow out the candles, and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. This man, who the world had dismissed as too old, too poor, too insignificant, had become a force for good that would ripple through generations. That night, after everyone had gone home, They sat on their new porch, wrapped in blankets, watching stars emerge in the cold December sky. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't bought the barn?" Arletta asked. Dalton considered it. "We'd still be in that trailer, I suppose. Still struggling, still invisible." "Would that have been so bad?" He looked at her. "No, because I'd still have you." She smiled. "Smooth talker. I mean it, Lida. The money, the barn, the foundation, it's all wonderful, but you're what matters. You always have been." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We make a good team. The best." By spring of the following year, the foundation had given away nearly $70 million. The impact was measurable now, not just in stories, but in statistics. Unemployment in Porter's Ridge had dropped by 18%. High school graduation rates had increased. Small business registrations were up. The town that had been dying was growing. But not everyone was happy. There were those who thought Dalton and Arletta were trying to buy influence, control the town, play God with people's lives. Accusations surfaced online, anonymous posts claiming the foundation was a front for something sinister. Investigations were demanded, though none ever materialized because there was nothing to find. Every dollar was accounted for, every decision documented, every recipient verified. Dalton ignored most of it. He'd learned that some people would always find fault, always need an enemy, always refuse to believe in goodness. That was their burden, not his. One afternoon in April, a documentary crew showed up. They'd been trying to film the story for months, and Dalton had finally agreed. Not for ego, but because he wanted the world to understand something important. That ordinary people could do extraordinary things. That age didn't diminish worth. That compassion wasn't weakness. The filming took 3 days. They interviewed Dalton and Arletta, Juniper, people helped by the foundation, historians, community members. They filmed inside the Heritage Center, walking the land, sitting on the porch of the house. The director, a woman named Sarah, asked Dalton a question on the last day. "Looking back, if you could do it all again, would you change anything?" Dalton thought for a long time. "I'd have bought the barn sooner," he finally said with a smile. The documentary, titled The Barnkeeper, premiered at a film festival that summer and won awards for storytelling. But Dalton and Arletta didn't attend. They watched it at home, on their couch, holding hands, surrounded by photos of their life together. When it ended, Arletta wiped tears from her eyes. "We're famous now," she said. "No," Dalton replied. "We're just finally seen." In August, Dalton's health took a turn. The chest pains that had been occasional became constant. He was admitted to the hospital, this time for a week. The doctors said his heart was wearing out, that there were procedures they could try, but at his age the risks were high. "How long?" he asked the cardiologist. "With treatment, maybe 5 years. Without, hard to say. Could be months, could be 2 years. Dalton chose no treatment. He didn't want to spend his remaining time in hospitals, hooked to machines, fighting for days he'd rather spend living. Arletta didn't argue. She understood. They'd always understood each other. He was released with palliative care instructions and a prescription for pain management. The news spread through Porter's Ridge quickly. People stopped by the house bringing food, flowers, prayers. It felt like a premature funeral, and Dalton hated it. "I'm not dead yet," he told Louise when she visited. "Stop acting like I am." "We're not," she said gently. "We're just grateful for the time we have." In September, Dalton insisted on going back to the barn. Arletta drove him, helped him walk slowly to the entrance. Inside, the museum was hosting a third-grade field trip. Children ran through the exhibits, asking questions, touching artifacts, recording stories. Dalton stood in the back, watching, his heart laboring but full. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, approached him shyly. "Are you Mr. Reed?" "I am." "My teacher says you're a hero." Dalton chuckled. I'm just a man who got lucky. My dad got a grant from your foundation, the girl continued. He started a business. Now we don't worry about money as much. Dalton's throat tightened. What's your name? Emily. Well, Emily, you tell your dad I'm proud of him. And you study hard, okay? Smart girls like you change the world. She beamed and ran back to her class. Arletta slipped her hand into his. That, he whispered. That's why. They stayed for an hour, watching the children learn, explore, dream. When they finally left, Dalton turned back one last time, looking at the barn that had started everything, and smiled. By October, Dalton was confined mostly to the house. He could still move around, still sit on the porch, but long trips exhausted him. Juniper visited every weekend, reading to him, playing cards, just being present. Arletta never left his side. The foundation continued its work, now fully operational without his daily involvement. Patricia sent weekly updates, and Dalton reviewed them from his armchair, nodding approval, suggesting tweaks, proud of what they'd built. In early November, he asked Arletta to bring him the letter. Elias Grayson's letter, the one that had started everything. She retrieved it from the safe deposit box where they kept important documents and handed it to him. He read it slowly, carefully, as if seeing it for the first time. He knew, Dalton said. Knew what? That whoever found it would need permission. Permission to use it, to trust it, to believe they deserved it. Arletta sat beside him. And did we deserve it? No, Dalton said, but we honored it. That's what mattered. On November 23rd, Dalton woke before dawn. His chest felt heavy, but not painful. Just tired. Arletta stirred beside him. You okay? She mumbled. Yeah, he said. Just thinking. About what? About how lucky I am. She propped herself up on one elbow, studying his face in the grey light. Lucky? I got to spend my life with you. I got to raise a family, work with my hands, help people. I got to matter. Not everyone gets that. Tears filled her eyes. You always mattered, Dal. Always. I know that now. He closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. When he woke again, it was afternoon. Juniper was there, sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading. Arletta was in the kitchen making soup. The house smelled like comfort. Hey, Grandpa, Juniper said softly. Hey, baby, how you feeling? Tired, he admitted. But good tired. The kind that comes from a life well lived. She took his hand. You changed everything, you know that? We changed it, he corrected. All of us. Dalton lived through Thanksgiving, surrounded by family and friends. He lived through Christmas, watching Juniper open the college acceptance letters that the Foundation's scholarship had made possible. He lived into the new year, welcoming 2026 from his front porch, Arletta beside him, the stars overhead endless and bright. And on a cold morning in late January, with Arletta holding his hand and sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, Dalton Reed took his last breath. He was 73 years old. He'd lived longer than he expected, harder than he'd wanted, and better than he'd dreamed. The funeral was held at the Heritage Center, the only space large enough to hold everyone who came. Over 500 people filled the barn, spilling onto the lawn, standing in the field Dalton had cleared with his own hands. People spoke about his kindness, his stubbornness, his quiet determination. They spoke about the lives he'd changed, the legacy he'd built, the reminder he'd given that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. Arletta sat in the front row, Juniper beside her, and listened to it all. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough in private. Here, surrounded by the proof of her husband's life, she felt only gratitude. After the service, people lingered. They shared stories, hugged Arletta, promised to keep the Foundation's work alive. And they did. In the months following Dalton's death, the Foundation expanded. New board members were added, new programs launched. The Heritage Center hosted classes, workshops, community events. Porter's Ridge continued to grow, to heal, to thrive. Arletta stayed active for 2 more years, helping guide the foundation, welcoming visitors to the barn, telling Dalton's story to anyone who'd listen. On her 72nd birthday, she recorded her own story for the Voices of the Ridge exhibit, talking about loving a stubborn man and buying a broken barn, and learning that hope isn't something you find, it's something you build. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning 3 years after Dalton. They were buried together in the small cemetery outside town under a simple stone that read, "Dalton and Arletta Reed. They saw what others missed." Juniper took over as executive director of the foundation at 22. She'd graduated college with honors, turned down corporate job offers, and returned to Porter's Ridge because she understood what her grandparents had known all along. That wealth wasn't about accumulation. It was about circulation, about giving it away, investing in people, trusting that kindness multiplied when shared. Anyone can be written off, dismissed, or underestimated, but sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest courage, and the smallest investments yield the most extraordinary returns. Because for Dalton and Arletta, and for everyone who refuses to stay invisible, worth is never measured in bank accounts. It's measured in lives touched, hope restored, and the stubborn belief that broken things still deserve to be fixed. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe everyone deserves a second look.